Senator Sheen.
Well, so that's a really frightening point. As we think about how do we do that, obviously sanctions are one option that we have, but what else should we be thinking about? I was in Copenhagen and I met with the person in their government who is working on this issue, their head of infrastructure. And one of the things that she said to me, I was asking her about this whole issue of, how are you all dealing with this? Because this is more of an issue for you than it is for us. And she said, well, the EU is working on the idea of having ships that can do the repairs in a timely manner, because the options, as I understand, our Codell that went to the Indo-Pacific met with a Japanese company that does subsea cables, and we were talking to them about, how do you deal with cable breaks? And they said, well, we track those, but we don't repair them. That has to be done by whoever owns the cables. And in order to do that, they said, there are basically two options. One is you need a bunch of ships that can do the repairs, and you need to have duplicate cables so that if one goes out, you've got another one that can replace it. But it seems to me, based on your testimony and sort of the conversations that I've had, that that's not the answer to the problem. The answer to the problem is to figure out how we can put in place ways to go after the vessels and the countries that are doing trying to disrupt these subsea cables. And, clearly to date, the U.S. government has not been willing to sanction the vessels that we seem to be aware of. And in fact, as we discussed earlier, Mr. O'Brien, we're actually giving a windfall to Russia so they can do more of this in the future. So what should we be thinking about if we're really going to address this? Dr. Schmidt, is the data that you have made public?
Yes, Senator, it is. We have a first volume in Underwater Mayhem, Volume 1, that's already out. We'll have in the next few months, and it's like, don't ask when a PhD dissertation is going to be submitted, but we'll say in a few months, Volume 2 is coming out as well. There's 2 points I want to make, Senator. First of all, in the case of repair vessels, there has to be more redundancy. There has to be more put on the water. 2 years ago when I was in Taipei, the interlocutors that I talked to asked me specifically, should we have a domestic repair capability in Taiwan? And I said yes. 2 years later, just a few weeks ago, they asked me the same question. I said, absolutely yes. The Matsu Island cables that were cut, these islands of Taiwan that are near the PRC coastline, those had an internet outage of weeks and weeks, which could have been much shorter if they weren't waiting for consortia vessels to come in. And I told them, in a case of a quarantine or an invasion of Taiwan, it's going to be very difficult. We saw this in the Straits of Hormuz situation with commercial vessels. They won't take that risk. Maybe governments will, but they will not take that risk in a time of war. So that's number one. We need, obviously, as you said, consistent sanctions policy. Having sanctions, your shadow fleet bill, with you and Senator Risch, we had Senator Whitehouse at the University of Pennsylvania a few weeks ago that I hosted talking about this. Those are essential. That will deprive the Putin regime of these oil windfalls. And we need consistent sanctions policy, whether it be no waivers in the previous administration for Nord Stream 2 and no waivers for Russian oil today. It's got to be consistent to keep the Putin regime in check.
I agree. And I'm sure, Mr. O'Brien, you're going to add to this, but not only would it have an impact on Putin, but it would have an impact on Xi in China and what they're doing, because obviously they are benefiting from the oil that's being delivered by the shadow fleet below market prices. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think 2 things. One is the information that's available now, I think, increases the responsibility of U.S. policymakers. If I'd had access to the kind of information Dr. Schmidt's providing, we would have designated everybody he just listed in the Svalbard incident. And so that and the fact that it's public makes it easier to bring other countries on board. And that's the main point. We need the U.S. to organize a very active coalition. So I've focused on sanctions, but I think it also means some physical presence at sea. The Straits off Copenhagen are a particular point of concern. And there are examples of the U.S. doing this based on the kind of authorities we already have. As long ago as the W. Bush administration, they organized a really effective voluntary coalition to address North Korea's activities. And I think that kind of thing's available in this area if we put our effort in.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and thank you both. I am actually headed down to an armed services hearing where I will raise the same question.
The hearing exposed growing fears inside Washington over the vulnerability of undersea internet cables, the invisible infrastructure carrying global communications, financial transactions, and military data. Senators and security experts warned that sabotage campaigns tied to Russia and China are no longer theoretical threats, but active geopolitical tactics capable of crippling economies and isolating nations during a crisis. Lawmakers focused heavily on the role of Russia's so-called shadow fleet, vessels accused of operating under obscure ownership structures while helping Moscow evade sanctions and potentially conduct covert maritime operations. Witnesses argued that the United States and its allies have failed to respond aggressively enough, despite mounting evidence linking suspicious ship movements to damaged submarine cables in Europe and Asia. Dr. Schmidt described how Taiwan's offshore islands suffered weeks-long internet outages after cables were cut near the Chinese coastline, highlighting how difficult and slow repairs can become during periods of tension. He warned that commercial repair ships may refuse to enter conflict zones during a blockade or invasion scenario, making domestic repair capability and cable redundancy essential for national security. The discussion also revealed frustration over what speakers called inconsistent Western sanctions policies. Experts argued that loopholes and waivers have allowed Russia to continue profiting from energy exports, indirectly funding activities that threaten global infrastructure. Senators suggested that stronger sanctions against vessels involved in suspicious operations could deter future sabotage while also sending a warning to Beijing. Former officials emphasized that intelligence transparency changes the equation. With more public data now available about ship tracking and cable incidents, they argued that policymakers can no longer claim uncertainty. Calls grew for a coordinated international maritime coalition, combining sanctions, surveillance, and physical naval presence, particularly around strategic choke points like the waters near Copenhagen. By the end of the exchange, the hearing framed undersea cable protection as more than a technical issue. It was presented as a frontline challenge in the broader strategic competition between democratic nations and authoritarian powers, with lawmakers signaling that the debate is rapidly moving toward military and economic countermeasures.